The creation of the AIIB and the BRICS Development Bank are major new initiatives that are transforming the financial architecture that had been pretty much unchanged since the creation of the Bretton Woods financial system after the end of the Second World War. So this is a very transformational change that has started to take place with major new shifts in the financial architecture through the creation of the AIIB, the BRICS Development Bank, and some other regional funds for infrastructure development. These new institutions have the potential to play a very important role in shaping the new financial architecture over the next 2 decades and beyond, because they're going to be able to create significant new financial flows for developing countries. And the main change that these new institutions are creating is that they're leveraging the rapidly growing economies such as China, India, and many other emerging markets around the world, and giving them a significant seat at the table. And that's very significant because these economies have become much more important in the last 20 years. Emerging markets back in 2000 were a very small share of world GDP, but by 2015 they're now about half of world GDP. So the size of their economies are much bigger. Their ability to provide funding into these new institutions is significantly greater. And looking into the future, that ability to fund these institutions is going to continue to grow as China becomes the world's biggest economy, as India becomes an economy larger than 10% of world GDP. And that means that developing countries are going to have a major new source of financial flows to assist them with their economic development. The old architecture based on the World Bank system will still, of course, be in place. So one of the key issues going forward is how will the old institutions, such as the World Bank Group, cooperate with these new institutions so that you don't have competition, but you have cooperation going forward. So I think it's exciting times for the financial architecture, and these changes are very positive for developing countries worldwide. I think we're entering an age where there's significant transformation going on in the structure of the global economy. The big shift that we're seeing is the rise of emerging markets, led very much by China. So I think when we look forward, the share of particularly the Asia-Pacific economies in world GDP is set to increase from about a quarter of world GDP 10 years ago to probably around half of world GDP in about 3 decades' time. So this transformation that's happening in the importance of emerging markets in the world economy has fundamental implications in many ways. It's creating major new markets in terms of the growth of consumer demand. It's creating new growth engines for the world economy as well, because as the US and the EU and Japan are becoming much more mature economies, more slow-growing economies, the new engines for the world economy are going to be the emerging markets, particularly led by the Asia-Pacific. So it's a very rapidly changing global economic landscape. And I think one of the most exciting features that we're going to see over the next 20 years because of the rise of the emerging markets is that South-South trade is going to be growing very rapidly. So trade between Asia and Latin America, trade between Africa and Asia, all of these dimensions of trade are going to be growing very quickly, which will help the development of the developing country regions. So I think historically over the last 30 years, a lot of the development momentum for Latin America and for sub-Saharan Africa was being driven by the growth of the EU, the US, and also Japan. In the future, over the next 20 years and beyond, these regions are going to be much more seeing the consumer markets of emerging Asia, such as China, India, and Indonesia, driving the demand for their commodities, And I think there'll be a lot more rapid growth in terms of bilateral trade in other areas as well, including manufacturing and services. So when we look at the long-term outlook for emerging markets, more and more they will be working in closer cooperation together in terms of boosting their trade and investment flows. At the moment, we're seeing a major transformation in the Chinese economy, which used to be growing at about 10% per year for a period of the last 3 decades. We're now entering a phase of gradual economic slowdown in China, where growth momentum is probably going to be in the order of 6.5% per year over the next 5 years. Beyond that, China will moderate further because it's now becoming an upper middle income country, and so we cannot expect those 10% growth rates anymore. By 2030, China may be growing at less than 5% per year. But I think what it means in the near term is that we have seen quite a shift in the structure of the Chinese economy away from heavy industry to more towards services. And this is already well underway because the new driving force for the Chinese economy is consumer demand rather than infrastructure development and export-led growth. That transformation that we're seeing in China has had quite an impact on developing countries since 2010 because commodity prices have slumped significantly. It's not all due to China. China is one factor, but there's other factors at play as well, including supply-side issues for some of the world's major commodities. But the net impact on emerging markets, particularly the big commodity exporting countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, and also Latin America, is that we've seen the impact of falling commodity prices and the slowdown in demand growth from China has hit very hard. And I think the near-term outlook is still very difficult for many of these commodity exporting emerging market countries. So I think this is a time where many emerging markets in Latin America and other parts of the world need to reconsider their economic development model. Of course, in the long term, commodities will still play a very important role, but I think there needs to be increasing diversification into other kinds of exports. And of course, China is still a huge consumer market. Right now, China accounts for about 10% of world consumption. In 20 years' time, that share is going to rise very substantially because we're seeing this shift to a consumer society in China with rapid growth in demand for a wide range of goods and services. So although commodities at the moment are having a difficult outlook, I think when we look longer term, there's going to be tremendous opportunities in areas such as soft commodities, where Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America are strong exporters of agricultural commodities, because I think China and India, as well as Indonesia, are probably going to be very fast-growing markets in the long term for agricultural commodities. I also think areas such as light manufacturing and also services do create opportunities for emerging markets. So I think we need to see some policy shifts. Although commodities will still play a very important role in the long-term outlook, clearly there needs to be diversification in the policies of many governments in developing countries to take into account this shifting structure of the engines of growth more towards consumer-driven growth coming out of the Asia-Pacific. I think many Latin American countries took the opportunity of a period of rapidly growing Chinese demand for commodities, what's referred to as the commodity supercycle that we saw over the last 20 years, to really take advantage of rapidly growing exports of many commodities. And although that helped Latin America for a long period of time, there was a sense that the good times would keep rolling on forever. And I think many countries didn't prepare for this structural change that China is now experiencing. And in the times when revenues were strong and export growth was good, not enough diversification was done into the underlying economic models of these countries. So I think in Latin America still, one of the key weaknesses in much of Latin America is that the manufacturing sector, in terms of the export-led sectors of manufacturing, haven't really grown sufficiently. They're not competitive on a global basis. So I think the new focus over the next 2 decades needs to be much more on how to become competitive in manufacturing exports and services exports as well. So I think there needs to be a diversification in the economic structure of many Latin American countries. Some countries have been successful in doing this. We're seeing very successful stories in Chile, for example. Colombia has made quite a dramatic transformation in its economy as well. But I think we need to see a wider approach to that across Latin America to take advantage of the new opportunities that are emerging in Asia. Commodities will still be important in the long term because clearly the growth of China, India, and also Southeast Asia will drive demand for commodities over the longer term. But there needs to be a shift so that the reliance on commodities is reduced, because over-reliance on commodities does create a lot of potential vulnerability, which we're now seeing because of the fluctuations in prices of commodities. And also I think there's weaknesses in the commodity-driven export model in terms of generating high value-added jobs. So, whereas I think manufacturing and services have better potential to create those higher value-added jobs and to help the economic development of Latin America in the long term.